Have you ever stopped to wonder what would actually happen if a metal sphere filled with old explosives, costing about the same as a used car, managed to cripple a $13 billion aircraft carrier? Not in a simulation, in real life, right in the middle of a contested waterway with the whole world watching. The real answer might surprise you more than you'd expect. So let's dig into this together. When we think about a modern naval war, especially a hypothetical clash between the United States and China, we usually picture lasers, stealth fighters, and missiles flying at 5 times the speed of sound. We imagine glowing screens in dark rooms and satellites tracking every movement from space. We imagine the absolute cutting edge of human technology clashing over the open ocean. We don't usually picture a heavy iron ball floating just beneath the surface of the water, waiting in the cold dark. Naval mines are the ultimate silent weapon. They are basically underwater bombs that don't need radar, don't need an engine, and don't need an operator. You just drop them in the water and let them wait. They are incredibly patient. They don't care about politics, and they don't care if the ship that hits them is a rusted cargo freighter or the USS Gerald R. $13 billion of American steel floating right into a $20,000 trap. Picture the Gerald R for a second. It is the most expensive piece of military hardware ever built by human hands. It is a floating city with 5,000 sailors living and working on it. It carries more firepower on its flight deck than most entire countries have in their whole air force. It is designed to track hundreds of targets in the sky simultaneously and launch a continuous wave of fighter jets. Whenever an aircraft carrier goes anywhere, it never goes alone. It travels inside a strike group. That means it is surrounded by a tight ring of destroyers and cruisers acting like heavily armed bodyguards. These escort ships are packed with advanced radar and interceptor missiles. They are the best in the world at looking up at the sky and looking far out to the horizon. They are looking for incoming jets, drones, and anti-ship missiles. But they are remarkably blind to what is floating just 30 feet under the waves. Water is incredibly heavy, and that changes the physics of an explosion completely. When a bomb goes off in the air, the energy spreads out and dissipates quickly. But when a bomb goes off underwater, the water acts like a solid wall, forcing the explosive energy to travel straight outward. It travels through the water like a massive, invisible hammer, punching straight into the weakest part of a ship, the thin steel belly underneath the waterline. The radar couldn't see fiberglass and old iron. The anti-missile lasers couldn't burn it out of the sky. There is just a sudden, violent shudder that rocks the entire 100,000-ton vessel. The lights flicker and die. The massive nuclear reactors automatically scram, shutting themselves down instantly to prevent a radioactive meltdown. The ship's speed drops from 30 knots down to 0. In an instant, the pride of the American fleet isn't a floating fortress anymore. It is just a very large piece of metal sitting completely still in the water. And the terrifying truth is that a stationary aircraft carrier in a dangerous stretch of ocean isn't just a broken ship. It is the biggest target in the world, and the moment it stops moving, the real nightmare actually begins. To understand how something so cheap could bypass everything, you have to understand how we actually defend an aircraft carrier. When the Gerald R sails into the Pacific, it doesn't just float out there exposed. It brings its own personal, invisible dome of protection. We call it an air defense bubble. This bubble stretches out for hundreds of miles in every direction. The cruisers and destroyers sailing alongside the carrier are equipped with radar systems so powerful they can track a golf ball flying through the air from miles away. If someone launches a missile, the computers instantly calculate its trajectory, its speed, and exactly when to fire an interceptor to knock it out of the sky before it ever gets close. We spent decades and billions of dollars perfecting this. We built a shield perfectly designed to stop things moving very fast, very high above the water. But that shield has a massive blind spot. And that blind spot is the ocean itself. Water isn't like air. You can't shine a radar beam through it. If you want to find something underwater, you have to use sound. You have to use sonar. You send out a ping of sound and listen for the echo. It sounds simple enough in theory, but the ocean is an incredibly messy place to listen to anything. There are whales. There are thermal layers where cold and warm water meet, and those temperature changes actually bounce sound waves back and confuse the sensors. There are thousands of commercial cargo ships churning up the water with their massive propellers. Trying to find a single, silent object floating in all that noise is like trying to hear a whisper in a crowded stadium during a rock concert. The most advanced radar on Earth is completely useless against a piece of metal sitting quietly in the mud. And the Chinese Navy understands this blind spot perfectly. While we spent the last 30 years building better missiles to shoot down other missiles, they were quietly building the largest stockpile of naval mines in the world. We're talking about roughly 80,000 of them. Some of these are old-school contact mines, the classic iron balls you see in movies from the Second World War. But a lot of them are incredibly smart. They're called influence mines. They sit on the seafloor, sometimes for months, completely asleep. They don't need to be bumped into to go off. Instead, they just listen. They wait for a change in the magnetic field or the exact sound of a massive American propeller. They can be programmed to ignore fishing boats, ignore cargo ships, and even ignore smaller warships. They literally wait in the dark until they hear the specific, undeniable acoustic footprint of a 100,000-ton aircraft carrier passing directly overhead. You don't even need an expensive submarine to put them there. A commercial fishing boat out in the middle of the night can just roll one off the back deck. By the time the sun comes up, the boat is gone and the trap is set. It changes the entire math of the ocean. You don't need to fight the carrier. You just have to make sure the water it needs to sail through is too dangerous to enter. But what happens when intelligence misses one? What happens when the carrier group has to push through a narrow strait? The sonar operators are staring at screens filled with static from the terrible acoustic conditions. And one of those smart mines finally hears the exact sound it's been waiting for. When that mine detonates, it doesn't look anything like a movie. There is no giant fireball rolling up into the sky. If you are standing on the flight deck, you might not even see a splash. But if you are deep inside the belly of the ship, in the engine rooms or the mess halls, you feel it before you hear it. Sound travels through water roughly 4 times faster than it travels through air. The shockwave hits the steel hull like a sledgehammer swung by a giant. To understand what happens next, you have to understand exactly how an underwater explosion works. When a few thousand pounds of high explosives go off directly underneath a ship, it rarely blows a neat hole through the bottom. That is not what does the real damage. What happens is actually much more violent, and it all comes down to basic physics. Water doesn't compress, steel does. When the explosives detonate, they instantly turn into a massive, superheated bubble of gas. Because the thousands of tons of ocean water surrounding that bubble refuse to be squeezed, all that explosive energy has only one direction to go: up. The expanding bubble acts like a hydraulic ram. It violently lifts the center of the aircraft carrier out of the water, bending the ship's massive steel spine. A fraction of a second later, the gas cools and the bubble collapses. The water violently rushes back into the empty space, and the center of the ship loses all its support. A 100,000-ton vessel suddenly drops down into a void. It is a 1-to-2 punch designed to literally break a ship in half. Now, the Gerald Ford is incredibly tough. It is built with layers upon layers of armored compartments. Its spine is engineered to take a massive beating, and against a single mine, it probably wouldn't snap. But a modern warship isn't just a hollow metal shell. It is a highly sensitive nervous system made up of millions of moving parts, computer servers, and high-pressure pipes. The shockwave rips through all of it. Pipes carrying water and steam instantly burst under the pressure. The massive metal tracks that guide the heavy elevators, the ones needed to bring fighter jets up to the flight deck, get violently twisted and jammed in their shafts. And then, the most critical safety system on the ship takes over. The Ford runs on 2 nuclear reactors. These reactors provide power to literally everything, from the spinning propellers to the radar dishes. And these reactors are designed to prioritize safety over everything else. The moment the internal sensors register a massive, violent physical shock, the computers don't wait for human permission. They automatically drop the control rods into the core. They shut the reactors down immediately to prevent a radioactive disaster. In less than 5 seconds, A floating city of 5,000 people goes completely dark. The massive ship doesn't stop moving immediately. It has way too much momentum for that. It coasts through the water, slowly bleeding speed, sliding blindly in the dark. Emergency battery lights flicker on, casting a dim red glow down miles of narrow steel hallways. The deafening constant roar of the ventilation systems and the engines suddenly goes dead quiet. It is instantly replaced by the screaming of emergency alarms and the shouts of damage control teams sprinting through the dark. Up on the bridge, the glowing screens that track hundreds of miles of airspace suddenly go black. The electromagnetic catapults on the flight deck, which need massive amounts of power to physically throw jets into the air, are totally dead. The carrier cannot launch planes, it cannot use its main defensive radar, it cannot even steer. The damage control teams on board are the best in the world. They are already sealing heavy metal doors and hunting for leaks, trying to figure out if the ocean is coming inside. They will fight to keep the ship afloat, and they will probably succeed. But as the giant ship slowly grinds to a halt, sitting completely dead in the water, a terrifying new reality takes hold. They are no longer a mobile fortress dominating the ocean. They are an island. And in a contested waterway, surrounded by an enemy that has been waiting for exactly this moment, being an island is the most dangerous thing you can possibly be. Picture what happens the moment a ship like the Gerald Ford actually stops moving in hostile waters. We are not talking about a quick pause to check the engines. The ship is completely dead, drifting blindly on the ocean currents. An aircraft carrier's entire survival strategy is built around moving fast, usually around 35 miles an hour, constantly changing its location so enemy satellites and missiles can never get a perfect lock on it. The moment it stops, the math changes completely. It goes from being a ghost in the vast ocean to a fixed set of coordinates on an enemy map. Inside that dark, echoing steel box are 5,000 human beings. If you didn't already know, a modern carrier is basically a floating small town. It has its own zip code, its own hospital, and its own fire department. Most of the sailors on board are under 25 years old. Within minutes of the reactors shutting down, the massive air conditioning systems stop pulling fresh air deep into the ship. The lower decks get dangerously hot very quickly. The emergency lighting casts long red shadows down miles of narrow hallways. It is completely silent, except for the frantic voices of damage control teams trying to figure out if the hull is holding. They are trapped in a giant metal box floating right in the middle of the most heavily armed patch of ocean on Earth, and for the first time in their lives, they are completely defenseless. A stationary carrier isn't a weapon anymore. It's a hostage. Think about what that actually means for the admiral in charge of the entire strike group. They are sitting in the command center of one of the nearby escort destroyers, watching the Ford slowly drift on the radar screen. Their entire job, the sole reason those cruisers and destroyers are out there, is to protect that carrier. Normally, it is a two-way street. The carrier protects the destroyers by launching waves of fighter jets to push the enemy far away. But with the Ford's launch catapults totally dead without power, those jets are just very expensive paperweights locked on a dark hangar deck. The escort ships have to immediately pull in tight. They form a desperate defensive circle around the wounded giant. They turn their radars to maximum power, scanning the sky, knowing that whoever laid that mine is already watching. Because that is the real, terrifying genius of using a naval mine this way. The mine was never meant to sink the Gerald Ford. It was meant to pin it in place. Now, the Chinese military doesn't have to guess where the American strike group is going to be tomorrow. They don't have to search the Pacific. They have an exact address. Land-based missile launchers, sitting safely hundreds of miles away on the mainland, can be dialed in perfectly. Long-range bombers can be loaded with anti-ship missiles and pointed at a target that cannot run away. The American escorts are incredibly capable, but their weapons are not bottomless. Every time a destroyer fires a $2 million interceptor missile to shoot down an incoming threat, that is one less missile they have in their tubes. They can't just easily reload out there on the water. They have to sit there, tied to a dying ship, burning through their absolute best ammunition just to keep the carrier from taking a second fatal hit. It becomes a brutal countdown, a deadly waiting game where the enemy has a massive supply of missiles firing from the safety of land, and the American ships only have whatever they brought with them. And the terrifying question isn't whether the destroyers can shoot down the first 50 missiles, but what exactly happens when they run out of interceptors to shoot down the 51st? When the Gerald Ford loses power, you can't just leave it there. You can't abandon a $13 billion flagship, and you definitely can't put 5,000 American sailors into inflatable lifeboats in the middle of a war zone. You have to get it out. But how do you actually move a broken skyscraper across the ocean? You can't call a tow truck for 100,000 tons of dead steel. You have to bring in specialized ocean-going fleet tugs. These are massive, powerful ships designed specifically to drag disabled warships out of the fire. But those tugs aren't usually sailing right next to the carrier. They are stationed at naval bases, maybe in Japan or Guam, hundreds or even thousands of miles away. It could take them 3 or 4 days just to reach the Gerald Ford. That is, 3 or 4 days of the carrier sitting absolutely stationary while the escorts burn through their missiles trying to keep it alive. And if those tugs actually manage to survive the journey and hook up the tow cables, the real nightmare begins. Normally, the Ford can cut through the water at roughly 35 miles an hour. It can outrun most submarines. But when it is dead in the water, being dragged by a tug, it is lucky to make 5 miles an hour. 5 miles an hour in a contested waterway isn't a retreat. It is a slow-motion execution. Think about the math of trying to escape at that speed. If safety is 500 miles away, you are looking at more than 4 straight days of crawling across the ocean. 4 days of being the largest, slowest target on a radar screen. This is where the brutal mathematics of the escort ships come into play. A modern American destroyer is a marvel of engineering. It has about 90 vertical launch tubes, which are basically silos built into the deck that hold different kinds of missiles. Not all of those are defensive interceptors, but let's say a ship has 50 ready to shoot down incoming threats. 50 sounds like a lot, but out here, 50 is nothing. When the enemy knows your carrier is moving at 5 miles an hour, they don't just send one missile to test your defenses. They send a swarm. They use older, cheaper missiles just to make your destroyers react. The basic rules of survival out there mean you usually fire 2 defensive interceptors at every incoming missile, just to guarantee you hit it. If the enemy fires a volley of 15 cheap drones or missiles, your destroyer has to fire 30 interceptors to stop them. In less than 2 minutes, more than half of your defensive shield is gone. And you can't just pause the war to reload. Loading those missile tubes requires a crane and completely calm waters in a safe port. Once a destroyer is empty, it is just a very expensive spectator. They don't need to sink the escort ships. They just need to make them run out of bullets. The Chinese military doesn't have a limit on how many missiles they can fire because they are firing from the mainland. They can just back up a truck, load another missile, and keep shooting. The American ships are fighting with their backs against the wall, hundreds of miles from home, with a finite number of shots. So the admiral out on the water has to make an impossible call. The destroyers are running dry. The carrier is barely moving. Do you order other warships to leave their posts and sail into the danger zone to replace the empty escorts? You are essentially feeding more ships into a meat grinder just to protect one broken vessel. And while that desperate math is playing out on the ocean, the commanders all the way back in Washington are staring at a completely different, much darker equation. While the sailors out on the ocean are living minute by minute, the people sitting in windowless rooms back in Washington are looking at a much worse map. They aren't just looking at one broken ship. They are looking at a chessboard where every single possible move leads straight into a nightmare. The military advisors have to stand in front of the president and explain that the most powerful naval force in human history is currently bleeding to death, and they only really have 2 options to stop it. And both of those options are terrifying. It all comes down to the oldest, most unbreakable rule of human conflict: geography. When the United States fights a war in the Pacific, it has to pack up its military and send it thousands of miles across the ocean. Every gallon of fuel, every replacement missile, and every fresh ship has to cross a massive expanse of water just to reach the battlefield. But the Chinese military doesn't have to cross an ocean. They are fighting from their own front porch. They have all their factories, all their supply lines, and all their deep magazines of weapons sitting safely on dry land right next to the fight. So the commanders in Washington are staring at a completely rigged game. Option 1 is to try and push more ships into the zone to relieve the empty destroyers. But to do that, those fresh ships have to sail through the exact same water where the Gerald Ford just hit a mine. They have to sail into the exact same missile range. You aren't rescuing the carrier. You are just feeding more $13 billion targets into a trap that has already proven it works. Option 2 is the one that keeps generals awake at night. If you want to stop the endless swarm of missiles from draining your destroyers and eventually sinking the carrier, you can't just keep shooting the arrows out of the sky. You have to kill the archer. You have to destroy the missile launchers themselves. But those missile launchers are not on boats. They are bolted to the ground on the Chinese mainland. To save the Gerald Ford, the United States would have to launch a massive wave of strikes against targets deep inside Chinese territory. You can't bomb the mainland of a nuclear superpower and expect them to keep the fight out on the water. The moment American bombs hit Chinese soil, the invisible fence holding the war together completely evaporates. It is no longer a localized fight over a broken ship in a contested waterway. It instantly becomes a direct, uncontrollable war between two nuclear-armed giants. Chinese leaders would be forced to respond, perhaps by targeting American bases in Japan or Guam, or even launching cyber attacks against the American power grid. This is the true, terrifying genius of the $20,000 mine. It wasn't just designed to rip a hole in the steel of an aircraft carrier. It was designed to rip a hole in the American decision-making process. By trapping the ship, they force Washington to make an impossible choice. Do you let your flagship and 5,000 sailors slowly get destroyed on global television? Or do you authorize a strike that could very easily trigger World War III? The mine creates a hostage situation where the cost of paying the ransom is simply too high. And while the leaders in Washington are paralyzed, staring at their maps and trying to find a third option that doesn't exist, the rest of the world isn't waiting. The shockwaves of a crippled American carrier are already spreading outward, and they are about to hit you right in your own neighborhood. While the president is sitting in the Situation Room trying to figure out how to avoid a nuclear war, the rest of the world is already reacting to the video. Because you can't hide a 100,000-ton aircraft carrier sitting dead in the water. Within minutes, footage from a commercial satellite or a passing drone is on every screen on Earth. And the moment that video hits, the global economy basically suffers a heart attack. To understand why, you have to look at what the United States Navy actually does every day. We usually think of them as a fighting force, but their main job during peacetime is actually just being the world's most heavily armed security guard. They sail around the oceans, guaranteeing something called freedom of navigation. That is just a military way of saying they make sure commercial cargo ships can sail wherever they need to go without getting bullied, hijacked, or sunk. The entire modern world is built on the absolute assumption that the oceans are safe. Roughly 90% of everything you buy, from your phone to your sneakers, comes across the water. But when the world sees the Gerald Ford crippled by a cheap iron sphere, that assumption vanishes overnight. The ocean suddenly becomes a very dangerous place. This is where the military reality crashes right into your everyday life. If you didn't already know, the people who actually control global shipping aren't admirals or politicians. They are insurance agents sitting in quiet offices in London and New York. Every massive cargo ship carrying thousands of shipping containers has to be insured. If a shipping company wants to sail through the South China Sea, and the insurance companies realize an American carrier strike group just got trapped there, they are going to do what insurance companies always do. They panic. They immediately revoke the insurance for that entire patch of ocean. Without insurance, a shipping company will not let a $100 million cargo ship leave the port. It is simply too much financial risk. So, the massive ships just drop anchor and stop. Within 48 hours of the Gerald Ford losing power, the busiest shipping lanes on the planet go completely quiet. And that is exactly when you feel it. Every time you fill up your gas tank, you are paying for the answer to this problem. When the ships stop moving, the global supply of oil and natural gas shrinks instantly. The price at the pump doesn't just go up a few cents, it skyrockets. The factories waiting for microchips to build cars have to shut down. The shelves at the store get thinner. The economic damage caused by that single, cheap naval mine starts costing the world billions of dollars every single day. They didn't need to destroy the American economy. They just needed to put a roadblock in the ocean. And while the economic panic is setting in, an even deeper fear is spreading among American allies. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines have built their entire national security around a single promise. The promise that if things ever got really bad, the American aircraft carriers would show up and save them. Now, their leaders are watching the flagship of the American fleet drifting helplessly, surrounded by destroyers that are slowly running out of ammunition. If $13 billion of American steel couldn't protect itself, it definitely couldn't protect them. The illusion of absolute American control is shattered. The countries that relied on the United States suddenly have to start wondering if they need to make a deal with China instead. The entire map of global power begins to violently rewrite itself. But the most terrifying part of this whole scenario isn't what happens during the first week of the crisis. It is what happens months later, when the United States Navy has to figure out how to ever sail into the Pacific again. Let's say they manage to pull off the impossible. The ocean tugs finally arrive, hook up the massive steel cables, and slowly drag the crippled Gerald Ford out of the danger zone. The escort destroyers fire every last interceptor they have, fending off waves of cheap drones and missiles. Maybe a few slip through. Maybe a destroyer takes a hit. But after a grueling, terrifying week, the strike group limps back to a safe port in Japan or Hawaii. The 5,000 sailors are safe. The ship didn't sink. On paper, politicians in Washington might even stand up at a podium and call it a successful rescue operation. But out on the water, every sailor in the fleet knows the truth. The conflict was lost the moment the ship stopped moving, because once that massive carrier is safely sitting in dry dock, getting patched up, the military planners have to sit down and face a terrifying reality. They have to ask themselves, the only question that matters, when do we send it back? And the answer they whisper behind closed doors is the one that actually changes the world. You don't. If a $20,000 piece of iron hidden in the mud can paralyze your $13 billion flagship and force your entire fleet to burn through its absolute best ammunition just to survive, you cannot risk putting it back in those waters. The math is completely broken. You can build all the stealth fighters and laser defenses you want, but if you can't guarantee the water underneath, the ship is safe. The ship is just a massive floating liability. They didn't need to sink the aircraft carrier. They just needed to make the ocean too expensive to sail in. Think about what that actually means for the future of global power. For 80 years, American military strategy has relied on one core idea. The idea that we own the oceans. If a crisis kicked off anywhere on Earth, the first question a president asked was always, where are the carriers? They were the ultimate symbol of showing up. But now, an adversary has proven that they can turn the waters around their own country into a permanent no-go zone without ever building a massive navy of their own. They don't need a ship that can beat the Gerald Ford in a straight fight. They just need thousands of cheap, smart mines and enough land-based missiles to punish anyone who gets stuck. They built a defensive moat across the Pacific, and they filled it with invisible traps. So, the United States Navy has to adapt. The carriers are forced to stay further back. Instead of sailing right up to the coastline to physically dominate the space, they stay 1,000 miles away, hiding in the deep ocean where the water is too deep for mines. But a carrier sitting 1,000 miles away isn't the same kind of threat. The fighter jets it launches, burn through half their fuel just trying to reach the target before they have to turn around and fly home. The physical presence is gone. And in the game of global power, physical presence is everything. The allied countries in the region, the ones who built their entire national security around the promise that the American fleet would always be there to protect them, watch the carriers pull back. They do the math. They realize the shield is gone. Quietly, without making a big scene, they start signing new trade deals and security pacts with Beijing. They bend the knee to the new reality. The map of global power gets entirely redrawn without a single treaty being signed, all because the most powerful ship in the world became too valuable to actually risk losing in a fight. The era of unquestioned naval supremacy wouldn't end with a massive, cinematic battle in the middle of the Pacific. It wouldn't end with a giant fireball, or a sinking ship, or a dramatic surrender. It would end the day the carrier stopped showing up. This is a hypothetical scenario. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict.